This video topic is quite controversial. The issue of North Korea, or the DPRK, has been one that has aroused strong emotions in people for generations. From the trauma of a devastating war, to the hostilities of a millennia-long nation being permanently divided, to the constant threats of outbreak of nuclear war, this topic continues to be one that Americans almost always come down on one side on. As you can no doubt guess from the very edgy title I made for this video, my thoughts on the whole DPRK issue are a little controversial in their own right. My position is that almost everything you have ever been told about North Korea, from the constant influx of stories about generals being executed in increasingly bizarre ways, to the endless stories about North Koreans discovering unicorns, to their apparent constant need to threaten to nuke the entire world, are lies created largely by the American and allied governments and media in order to justify potential military action against North Korea. Think weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. Now, I understand that my position is definitely the minority one here, that everyone just kind of knows that North Korea is the hermit kingdom, a crazy hell on earth that starves its own people. It's common knowledge. I understand that, at least socially, the burden of proof is kind of on me. So I'm going to go out of my way in this video to use a large amount of anti-North Korean sources to argue this point, be it capitalist historians and academics, or even the South Korean and American governments. I want to show that even with sources which could hardly be called pro-North Korea, America, and to a lesser extent South Korea, can themselves be shown to be the aggressors, with America hellbent on continuing genocidal aggression against a far weaker country, a country they have already genocided and who their population longs to genocide again. Now, to start this video, I think it would be best to get to the very beginning of this conflict, to the reign of the Japanese Empire, and to the genesis of modern Korea, North and South. In the early 1900s, the Japanese Empire was ascendant. Fresh off their victory over the Russian Empire in 1905, they proved themselves the only non-white empire on Earth capable of beating a European empire in conventional war. Emboldened, Japan would go on to create the bedrock of the later Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which promised, in theory, to use the fact that Japan was one of the only industrialized non-white countries on Earth to the betterment of the non-industrialized countries of Asia, giving them modernization and allowing them to fight off their European oppressors. Now, in practice, what this actually meant was Japan occupying and stealing the resources and people in all the countries they conquered, and killing and oppressing just as many people as the white empires they sought to replace. And no conquered place would suffer as much proportionally under Japanese occupation as Korea. First annexed in 1910, Korea would suffer under 35 years of Japanese rule. By the end of World War II, fully 20% of Koreans ended up abroad, or laboring in provinces other than own, with a large number of these being slave laborers. Of all those enslaved, about 10% would be worked to death. The Japanese even took to enslaving hundreds of thousands of Korean girls for reasons you can use your imagination for, something that modern-day Japanese politicians still deny to this day, photo of this guy included for no real reason. All of this suffering caused a large amount of resistance within Korea, from across the political spectrum, from moderates to nationalists to communists to even anarchists. However, the majority of historians agree that it was the communists who provided the majority of resistance to Japanese rule. These communists would wage basically a civil war against the small but powerful Koreans who were collaborators with the Japanese, with one of the most important anti-Japanese guerrilla fighters being Kim Il-sung, who was forced north into Manchuria by a collaborator general. As World War II came to a close with the American Empire crushing the Japanese Empire under the weight of 2 nukes, plans were made for a Cold War splitting of the long-occupied Korea. American officers Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel decided on the 38th parallel after consulting no Koreans and a National Geographic map. The Soviets would accept this division, and the Soviet occupation of the North and American occupation of the South would begin. This meant obviously that the North would be governed by socialism and the South by capitalism. Prior to the division, Korea had been governed by a quasi-feudal, quasi-capitalist system in which the vast majority of the populations were either peasants or generational slaves, ruled by a small feudal elite and, starting in the 1930s, a burgeoning capitalist class. The North would respond to this with mass redistribution of land and purging of the previous collaborator class. The South would in turn, being capitalist, seek to maintain the rule of this small upper class, the vast majority of whom were collaborators with the Japanese Empire. A report by the CIA themselves found out that the leadership of the right, that being the leadership of South Korea, is provided by that numerically small class which virtually monopolizes the native wealth and education of the country, since it fears that an equal distribution of the vested Japanese assets, that is, colonial capital, would serve as a precedent for the confiscation of concentrated Korean-owned wealth. It has been brought into basic opposition with the left. Since this class could not have acquired and maintained its favored position under Japanese rule without a certain minimum of collaboration, it has experienced difficulty in finding acceptable candidates for political office, and has been forced to support imported expatriate politicians such as Syngman Rhee and Kim Koo. These, while they have no pro-Japanese taint, are essentially demagogues bent on autocratic rule. The South Korean government itself would actually launch its own official investigation into collaboration in 2004, which estimated that upwards of 90% of the pre-1990 South Korea elite had ties to collaborationist families or individuals. And a June 1947 survey determined that 8 of 10 provincial police chiefs and 60% of low-ranking lieutenants were Japanese-trained. This omnipresence of Japanese collaboration amongst the government of the South even reached the highest levels of power. Park Chung-hee, who was president of South Korea from 61 to 79, as well as Chung Il-kwon, who served as prime minister of South Korea from 64 to 70, both received their political origins from within the fascist Japanese army. In fact, of all the army chiefs from the 1st to 10th generation of the South Korean military, graduated from the Japanese army. This is no small feat, mind you. This means that the vast majority of the South Korean government, according to its own modern concession, was made up from the generals to the police, from Koreans who actively helped the Japanese to genocide their own population. Now, because the vast majority of Korean people, both North and South, were not these collaborators, U.S. intelligence itself found that in 1945, for instance, that 95% of the 2 million Koreans in Manchuria, which is technically not Korea, but is the most Korean part of China, for instance, were anti-Japanese, where only 5% were pro-Japanese collaborators. This meant that the heavily collaborationist upper-class-led South was very unpopular among the majority of its own population. It is a confirmed, although rarely talked about fact, that the majority of the Korean population, both North and even South, prior to the Korean War actually supported socialism more than capitalism. In the PhD thesis of Young Jong Sim, he found that the public opinion polls had enough evidence to support the superiority of the left. The public opinion polls by the U.S. military government in 1946 determined that 70% of 8,000 people supported socialism, 10% communism, and 13% capitalism. According to the Korean Journalists Association poll of public opinion on July 3, 1947, 70% of 2,495 people supported the People's Republic that was widely used by the communists as the name of the new nation. From the same poll, 71% preferred the People Committee led by the KCP to the existing administration created by the U.S. military government. Even the quite critical of North Korea book, Politics in North and South Korea, Political Development, Economy, and Foreign Relations, by these lovely people, concurs on page 17 that the survey conducted in the South by the U.S. Army military government in Korea on August 13, 1946, shows that a large number of South Koreans had positive views of socialism. Of being asked their preferred political ideology, 14% supported capitalism, while 70% chose socialism, and 7% supported communism. So while the majority of Koreans were not technically communists, the statistical majority of them, at least according to the United States government itself, leaned far more towards socialism than capitalism. Which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. A similar thing was happening all over the world at this time. Under fascist occupation, the majority of resistance came from the communists. In Vichy France, the largest organization fighting Nazi occupation was the French Communist Party. In fascist Italy, the majority of opposition to the fascist state come from the communist guerrillas, with Mussolini himself being beaten to death by communist partisan Walter Audizio. In China and Vietnam, the most dedicated opposition to Japanese occupation came from the communists, especially in Manchuria, and as a result, communism was quite popular among a huge chunk of these countries' populations. America actually had to rig elections against communists in both France and Italy, and communists would actually take power in China and Vietnam. In Japanese-occupied Korea, the communists were likewise the backbone of resistance. The majority of Korea's population being left-wing really matters here because when it came down for the North and South to crack down on dissent, the South had far more dissenters to crack down upon, and subsequently would kill far, far more people. The South Korean government published a Truth and Reconciliation Commission dedicated to investigating alleged past crimes of their own government, something that I actually quite respect, and what they found would probably surprise the majority of people. They found that the commission had received 9,600 petitions for massacres from the Korean War period of 50 to 53. Out of those 9,600 petitions, South Korean forces conducted 7,922 individual massacres, and North Korean forces conducted 1,687 individual massacres, meaning that the commission attributed 82% of all petitions regarding wartime massacres to state agents, i.e. South Korean ones, or groups associated with the state, and only 18% to enemies of the state, i.e. the North Koreans. So by its own admission, South Korea was committing far more massacres. Not only this, but when it comes to the size of these individual massacres, the South Korean government found that the Bodo League massacre had killed over 200,000 people, and that it constituted the largest mass killings during the Korean War period. So again, by its own admission, the South Korean government was committing far more and far deadlier massacres. These Bodo League killings started prior to the war itself, meaning prior to the North's invasion and aggression. This is important because the idea of the North starting it has since 1950 been the backbone of America's justification for their intervention and subsequent killing of millions in Korea. The truth is that, far from the invasion being the start of the conflict, it was much more a continuation of pre-existing conflict between Japanese collaborators and communists which went back decades even before America arrived. Now, we've already covered how Kim Il-sung, the communist rebel leader, was forced to flee Korea by Japanese collaborator generals, but it actually gets much deeper than that. After the end of the Japanese occupation, perhaps the strongest source of left-wing activism, labor struggle, and labor power in all of South Korea was in Jeju Island. All this far-left labor had very little to do with foreign communist funding or support, with the US military government of the region himself stating that Jeju was a truly communal area that is peacefully controlled by the People's Committee without much Comintern influence. So when the US military government in Korea staged very obviously fraudulent elections in the South, confirming the permanent division of North and South and leading to the unpopular collaborationist right-wing government, the Workers' Party of South Korea, which had the support of the majority of the population of Jeju Island, staged a general strike that threatened the already weak post-war economy of the South. In response, the South Korean government fired into these crowds, and when the protesters responded back by rioting and burning a police precinct to the ground, the South Korean government would begin to exterminate much of the island's 300,000 population. A South Korean committee's best estimate of the total war killed were 30,000, about 10% of the island's population. Some 70% of the island's 230 villages were burned to the ground, and a staggering 39,000 plus homes were destroyed. The governor of Jeju himself estimated that 60,000 deaths had happened, about 1/5 of the entire island's population. This, you could imagine, would help cause revolts in much of South Korea, which were again put down by the fascist regime. All this happened years before the North officially invaded the South. Now, this is important, again, because Americans will often justify the murder of 3 million Koreans, largely by the US military, by saying that the North started it, and therefore America's response was justified. But the truth is a lot more muddy than this. Mass political violence between communists and Japanese collaborators, which again was what this war largely was, had been happening for years prior to when Americans considered the war to have started. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you have to be pro the North's invasion. You can still feel like it was morally or politically the wrong choice, although the idea of invading your own country is kind of weird, and it should be noted that the US and South Korea both had plans to invade the North themselves, so the war between the two was probably inevitable no matter what happened. The South, 1 year before the war had even begun, had already expanded its military to about 100,000 troops, a strength the North had not matched until early 1950, and South Korean dictator Syngman Rhee very brazenly supported invading the North to American officials. People will project modern history onto the past. People take the fact that current North Korea is a worse place to live on average than current South Korea, for reasons I will get into later on in this video, as a justification for America's intervention. After all, we saved the South from having to become like the North. But the North and South Korea of the early Cold War are not the North and South Korea of today. South Korea was a fascist dictatorship, objectively more oppressive than its northern counterpart. The North had some of the most wide-ranging increases of women's rights in modern Asian history. It gave material support to multiple anti-colonial struggles, while South Korea would actively help America invade and occupy Vietnam. The invasion of the North was the invasion of a much less brutal, much more popular government against a much more brutal regime that had no popular legitimacy or support among its own population. Without the American invasion, the Korean War would have been a comparatively much shorter, less violent conflict, as the functional popular North was already defeating the much more violent, less efficient, and less supported South. It was America's intervention that turned the Korean War into one of the most apocalyptically violent wars in living memory, to the point that I don't think most people understand just how violently America waged war in Korea in the name of preserving this fascist South. America would drop more bombs at Korea than all sides dropped the Pacific Theater of World War II combined. Not a single building above 2 stories was left standing. The Americans actually ran out of targets, and soldiers were regularly left to simply drop bombs in the ocean because there were no more Korean targets capable of being bombed. American general and hero of World War II Douglas MacArthur said in a May 1951 testimony to Congress that, "The war in Korea has already almost destroyed the nation of 20 million people. I have never seen such devastation. I have seen, I guess, as much blood and disaster as any living man, and it just curdled my stomach the last time I was there. After I looked at the wreckage and all those thousands of women and children and everything, I vomited." Now keep in mind that Douglas MacArthur was the guy that wanted to drop dozens of nukes on China, and he thought what America did to Korea was vomit-inducing mass slaughter. The South Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that among the victims of massacres, the victims of U.S. Army massacres suffered the highest rates of PTSD rates at 40.9%. To produce yet another quote by yet another American general, bombs away Curtis LeMay, the United States killed off about 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or as victims of starvation and exposure. To put that into perspective, Hitler killed about 6 million Poles out of a population of 35 million, albeit in a larger country. This means that it killed about 17% of the population, meaning that the United States killed off a larger percentage of Korea's population than Adolf Hitler killed of Poland's. At this point, it basically becomes impossible to talk about this topic without bringing up American racism at this time. In the early 1950s, when America was waging this war, America still had legalized Jim Crow in the South. It was an explicitly white supremacist nation. They didn't exactly care about Asian people and viewed them more or less as expendable in the name of preserving American global hegemony. George Kennan, perhaps America's leading strategist during the Cold War, said in 1948, just 2 years before the start of the Korean War, that America had about 50% of the world's wealth but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere to our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. He continued, "We should dispense with the aspirations to be liked, or to be regarded as the repository of high-minded international altruism. We should stop putting ourselves in the position of being our brother's keeper, and refrain from offering moral and ideological advice. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less then we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better." And this is on an American website. America admits to this shit. Now, by this time, the people sympathetic to America's point of view will generally say that yes, America may have been incredibly brutal, but this brutality was a net positive because it prevented the South from becoming like the North, a brutal dictatorship that starves its own people. So let's finally get into this idea of the Koreans starving their own people, shall we? How hungry are North Koreans in comparison to similarly situated countries, and what extent can this be said to be the fault of their government? Well, the DPRK keeps much of its internal documents under close wraps, so 100% accurate figures can be hard to come by, but luckily Hazel Smith, who is a research associate in Korean studies, published an article for the North Korea Review in 2016 that quotes extensively from mainstream sources, namely UNICEF, the WHO, WFP, FAO, and others. She appears not to have any significant anti-American bias. She's an advisor to the US government and even says that she believes that American and UN sanctions are not intended to have adverse humanitarian consequences for the civilian population of the DPRK. This is in spite of the fact that America very much does intentionally use sanctions to cause civilian suffering in nations it is opposed to, as America itself has conceded. So she is definitely not someone who is just being anti-American for the sake of it. She found that North Korea, big surprise, genuinely does struggle with near constant problems of malnourishment and hunger. She found that in 2012, for instance, 27.9% of North Korea's population suffers from what is called stunting, meaning that their caloric and nutritional needs are so insufficient for healthy growth that their physical growth therefore stunts. The DPRK also has, at least compared to most first world countries, relatively high infant and child mortality rates, with about 22 and 27 dying for every 1,000 respectively. Although it should be noted that the data she quotes from is from 2012. Data from 2020 shows that North Korea's under 5 mortality per 1,000 is 15.4, less than half the 36.6 per 1,000 that is the global average. None of this should be that surprising. The DPRK is a third world country after all, so them being poor and malnourished is kind of to be expected. What should be taken into account, however, is two things. The first being how poor the DPRK is in comparison to similar countries, and the second, why they are so poor in the first place. Hazel Smith quotes a 2013 South Korea study which found that the age-standardized death rate of North Korea was 858 out of 100,000. This value was higher than South Korea's 436 or China's 731, but it was lower than those of fellow Southeast Asia region countries like India's 1,147 and Indonesia's 961, and it was around the same level as Egypt's 860 or Jordan's 873, which have been reported as being countries with relatively higher income levels than North Korea. This is something that even data from organizations like UNICEF demonstrates. In 2020, the DPRK actually had less than half the child death rate of India and a significantly lower child mortality rate than the Earth in general. Likewise, stunting in North Korea was 18.9% in 2018, according to UNICEF, compared to a 2020 world average of 22%, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So North Koreans, while being genuinely poor and hungry, have that poverty very much embellished in the American public's imagination. They are portrayed as being a hermit kingdom whose leaders intentionally starve their own people, while they actually suffer from less poverty and arguably even less hunger than the average person on Earth, especially in the Third World, the vast majority of which are capitalist and aligned with the US. We hear constant stories of North Korea's hunger problems, but very seldom do we hear about capitalist India or Indonesia's significantly worse problems talked about in nearly the same way, that being them starving their own people. But, after all, should we really be comparing to the DPRK to countries like India and Indonesia, Egypt and Jordan, countries hundreds if not thousands of miles away? Shouldn't we be comparing them to South Korea instead, that country that shares the exact same name and is right next door? Isn't that the most comparable country? Aren't they significantly better off than the North? And in many ways, today at least, yes they are. South Korea does genuinely have significant economic advantages over the North. No one denies this. But when we get into the history of how that came to be, the picture is a lot more nuanced. Now, believe it or not, and I genuinely had a difficult time believing this when I first heard it, North Korea actually was economically stronger and more prosperous than South Korea up until around the mid-1970s, when state socialist countries began to stagnate economically. During this period of stagnation, the South's economy would boom, with the North's GDP per capita only increasing from $477 in 1973 to $811 in 1989, while the South's economy would grow more than tenfold from $414 to $5,724 in the exact same period. The major economic boon to the South was greatly aided, although not entirely caused, by massive aid and trade with the United States, who gave $12.6 billion worth of aid from 1946 to 76. To put this into perspective, the amount of aid given to all to Africa and Latin America was $6.85 billion and about $15 billion respectively. Now, to be fair, North Korea would also receive foreign aid from the USSR during the same period, just nowhere near as much as South Korea received from the US. Now, while this economic stagnation for the North was certainly not the best time for the North Koreans, it was far from the absolute devastation we now associate with the country's economy. For this to come to pass, we'll have to get to the period after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Losing their greatest economic trading partner and aid giver was completely and utterly devastating to North Korea, and in many ways they haven't even come close to recovering. Their GDP per capita went from $811 in 1989 down to $222 in 1995. This coincided with the complete collapse of cereal production, for which the DPRK is likewise yet to get even close to recovering from almost 9 million tons in 1993 to only 5 million tons in 2013. No surprise that this helped lead to a massive famine which killed upwards of 500,000 people. Since the famine, North Korea's life expectancy is yet to recover. While the population and life expectancy both literally doubled prior to this, from 9 million people in 1946 to 21 million in 1993, and from 38 years in 1940 to 74 years in 1986, their life expectancy has plummeted to just 70 years old in average in 2013. The effects of this loss of their greatest trading partner have been harshly exacerbated by sanctions led largely by the United States and UN. These sanctions, ostensibly done in the name of human rights, which is hilarious considering that countries like Saudi Arabia have almost no sanctions, are very much intended to cripple the North's economy, and thus consequently their population along with it. While many Americans don't understand just how brutal American sanctions are, one of my next videos will be on this topic, the intent to use them to destroy enemies is quite blatant. Just pause and read this actual State Department document to see how. Take oil, for instance, which is insanely restricted in North Korea. As a result, their oil consumption fell from 3.8 million metric tons in 1991 to only 0.75 million in 2017, a decrease of over 80%. This means that South Korea has access to more oil in a single day than the North has access to over a single year. Now, I don't know how many of you kept up with your recent Iraqi history, but oil is arguably the world's most important resource, especially for a third world country like the DPRK that doesn't have strong access to renewable energy. Add on to this numerous other sanctions banning things like all industrial machinery, and it becomes pretty apparent that this is basically physically, mathematically impossible for North Korea's economy to be anything other than a basket case, albeit a basket case with lower malnutrition rates than most third world countries. This isn't to say that I particularly like North Korea's government or think it's doing great, more on that in the end of this video, but it is very rich hearing from Americans the horrors, both real and imagined, that hungry North Koreans go through every day, without any of them knowing or even acknowledging that their own government intentionally goes out of its way to make the very same hunger as bad as possible. Even ex-American President Jimmy Carter acknowledges this contradiction. If North Korea's government did literally everything right out of the goodness of their own heart, their economy would still be fucked and their people would still be hungry. Now, we've all heard the crazy stories about North Korea before. That Kim Jong-il golfed 11 holes in one and bowled a perfect 300 his first ever try. That he never pooped or peed. That he can control the weather, and that, more impressively, he invented hamburgers. That his son, the now reigning Kim Jong-un, who has his own sex cult by the way, has made it punishable by death to have his hair cut, as well as making it punishable by death to not have his hair cut. That state officials are executed in bizarre ways, like when Kim Jong-un's uncle was fed to dogs, or when his defense minister was executed by aircraft gun for falling asleep. That he killed his entire sex cult, and then banned Mother's Day. Now, believe it or not, almost every crazy story you've ever heard about North Korea, even from your supposedly reliable mainstream news outlets, are lies, or at the very least completely unfounded, and I'm going to prove it. When you actually try to find the source behind any claim about North Korea, not just accepting the crazy-sounding headlines at face value, but actually trying to find if there's evidence for it, you usually end up with one of three things. You either look for source after source and find the original claim is unsourced, you find intentional misunderstandings, or you find US-backed sources who clearly have no reason to be honest. When you try to look for the origins of the claim that Kim Il-jung invented the burrito and hamburger, for instance, you start with Fox News, which redirects you to the Washington Examiner, which quotes a report from the New York Post, which quotes a report from The Sun, which is a British tabloid magazine, which states, "The wild claim follows an equally batty propaganda story that alleges that Kim Jong-il invented a dish called the double bread with meat, which is uncannily like the hamburger." And when you actually watch the video they have, it's just a normal video of Korean people making food. Nowhere does it actually claim that the Kims invented burritos and hamburgers. And when you go to the actual North Korean source, which I know is obviously itself state media, but it is the state media that they source is quoting, so we have to look at it, they recently published an article which contains the quote, "The demonstration was also given by famous cooks who showed cuisine of foreign pastries such as hamburgers and hot dogs." So a North Korean state source being quoted is fully aware of the foreignness, i.e. not created by the Kims, of hamburgers. So here you have a reputable news source quoting another reputable news source quoting a not-so-reputable source quoting a tabloid literally just making shit up. The claim that North Korea discovered unicorns was likewise, believe it or not, also bullshit. In spite of the story being replicated by countless news sources, the origin is actually quite mundane. The supposed unicorn in question is actually a creature from Korean mythology, and the DPKR's claim was not to have found it, but instead to have found a cave associated with the myth. This is like if North Koreans were taught that Irish people actually believe in the existence of the Celtic demigod Cuchulainn because a stone associated with a legend actually exists. Even many stories from the survivors of North Korea, and I'm not saying all emigres are lying, although some do, many of these stories will exaggerate their own experiences in order to get more views or popularity, most famously and most comically of all coming from North Korean defector Yeomi Park. Park's story has changed multiple times in the last few years. She used to claim a life of austere poverty, but over a decade ago on South Korean television, she appeared and called her mother the Paris Hilton of North Korea and talked about how rich they were in the North. She used to claim that she even saw a woman executed for watching a James Bond movie and then later claimed it was a South Korean DVD. It should be noted that even other people who have escaped North Korea, who have no reason to take the North Korean government's side, have laughed at the idea that you could actually be killed for watching a movie at all. She said in a BBC radio interview that her and her sister lived with her aunt and uncles, while in a different interview with a diplomat, she said that they were borderline homeless with no adults around and had to eat crass to survive, in spite of the fact that in another interview years later, she was asked, "When we talk about stories of people eating grass or people struggling to eat," Park said, "No, that never happened." She even made the laughably absurd claim on the Joe Rogan podcast that,
Yeah. When you were talking about going to the doctor when you were a child, and that this is a very disturbing story, but I want you to try to explain it to people, how people were dying in these hospitals and rats would eat the eyeballs of the people who were dying, and children who were starving would eat the rats. And then the children would die and the rats would eat the children.
Yeah.
"You see, Simba, when North Korean children die, they get eaten by the rats. Then the North Korean children eat the rats. You see, we are all part of each other." So why are the vast majority of Americans willing to accept such absurd and unfounded stories about North Korea? Well, the answer is a fun little thing called Orientalism, which is essentially Western ideas and stereotypes about the East that date back to the colonial era. The idea that the East is a strange and exotic place, and that everything they do must be viewed through this lens. For instance, you've probably all seen the video of North Koreans engaging in mass crying in response to their previous leader, Kim Il-sung's death. They had the streets filled with people who were crying in what was often considered to be a mass cult-like behavior. But the thing is that this mass cult-like behavior is just a mass display of grief and is a common part of Confucian culture and has been for centuries in China and both parts of Korea. South Korea has actually had similar mass outbreaks of grief after South Korean politicians' deaths. You don't see it reported in nearly the same way because they are a geopolitical ally. This mass crying, as weird as it may be to a Westerner with no backing in Confucian culture, like me, is largely normal in that part of the world. Everything they do, be it normal to them or not, must be interpreted through the lens of a bizarre and alien Eastern nation. This pre-existing ignorance, not always malicious, although often used in that way, of foreign cultures, plus all the fake and misleading stories added on top of that, make it very easy for the average American to believe literally anything about North Korea, including that they want to nuke the entire world. To get into the question as to whether or not North Korea wants to nuke the entire planet, it's important to get into the history of why they have nukes in the first place, because believe it or not, North Korea even having nukes is a relatively new phenomenon. The DPRK spent the entirety of the Cold War without nukes and only really began developing them after the fall of their greatest trading partner and protector, the Soviet Union. This drive was ended under Bill Clinton, who, with the help of Jimmy Carter, got the North Koreans to limit their nuclear ambitions in exchange for American lessening of its sanctions and end to hostilities. This would end, of course, under George W. Bush, whose ending of these olive branches and his axis of evil speech is largely considered the thing that pushed the DPRK over the edge into actually developing nukes. During the speech, he would define Iran, Iraq, and one of those Koreas as having a fundamentally terroristic outlook on the world, and pledged strong American opposition to all three of them. This was immediately followed by the US invading Iraq in a war that destroyed the country and killed around 1 million people. Obviously, after this, Iran and the DPRK were not just going to sit around and wait for what happened next. Both of them began refunding their nuclear programs, with the DPRK finally announcing their first nuke in 2005, 3 years after the Axis of Evil speech. The unfortunate truth is that when you are a significantly smaller and weaker country than the one threatening you, damn near the only way to guarantee you won't be invaded is to have a nuke to ensure mutually assured destruction. Look at Cuba in the Cold War. The United States had real material plans to invade the tiny island, but getting nukes stopped this plan in its tracks. North Korea having nukes objectively makes it far less likely to be invaded and genocided again, so it's no wonder why America's openly talked about denuclearizing North Korea in an attempt for regime change. Under Trump, John Bolton publicly declared his attempt to follow the Libya model for North Korea. The Libya model, if you don't know, is when the US got Muammar Gaddafi to give up his nuclear program and then, against the vastly weaker Libya, invaded and helped turn the country into one of the richest in Africa to an open-air slave market. So after watching both Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein undo their nuclear programs and subsequently have themselves and their country destroyed by Western imperialism, it's no wonder why North Korea is so gung-ho about having nukes. Now, some may argue, just because North Korea having these weapons may be understandable, that doesn't necessarily make their actions after getting them justifiable, i.e. their constant threats. The first thing you have to understand is that, much like the other news about the DPRK, a lot of these stories about them threatening other countries are overblown. Remember a few years ago when North Korea said it had a present for the US and Twitter blew up with people worried that America was going to be imminently bombed. Plus, America is the only country to ever actually use nuclear weapons in war, twice, both times on largely civilian targets. Not only this, but America flew nuclear-equipped planes over North Korea dozens of times in the Korean War and stationed almost 1,000 nukes pointed at the North from South Korea from 1958 to 1991, decades before the North ever even got nukes. Not only this, but almost every president in recent history has explicitly threatened to destroy North Korea, a country's population we have already killed about 20% of. So is it any wonder why this country is so adamant about keeping nukes? But why does any of this matter? Why does it matter that America genocided North Korea? Why does it matter that while North Korea does have hunger problems, they're not as bad as they're often made out to be, and partially because of American economic warfare? Why does it matter that most stories about the country believed by Western media are lies? Why does it matter that them having nukes is justifiable or not? A survey by YouGov and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, published in 2019, finds that a third of Americans would be in favor of a nuclear strike in North Korea even if it killed 1 million people. Keep in mind that this was a preemptive strike, meaning killing over 1 million people before North Korea even did anything. Not only has America genocided North Korea in living memory, but tens of millions of Americans are so terrified of this small half of a peninsula that they support doing it again. And this, dear listener, is why this topic matters so much. As I said earlier, these constant lies and exaggerations about North Korea aren't just innocent little things. They are made for a reason and have very real political consequences. Constantly dehumanizing this country and its people has not only allowed Americans to kill millions of their people in the past, it has made it so that millions of Americans want to do it again. These lies serve the interests of American imperialism in the same way that lies about Vietnam and Iraq help to justify imperialism in both of those countries. You don't have to be a pro-North Korea person to see any of this. Believe it or not, I don't really have much love for North Korea. I've just held off my criticism until the end of this video, and I'll give you my 3 reasons why. 1. Almost everyone in my audience is already aware of all the bad things about North Korea, both real and imagined. 2. It's genuinely difficult for me to see to what extent North Korea is really doing the bad things for which they are often accused. Believing anything about the country is genuinely hard with so much speculation, info, and lies going around in all directions all the time. And 3. I think it's more important for me as an American to focus on the crimes of my country, which I theoretically have more control over, and which are objectively far worse than those of Korea in scope and scale. From what I've been able to parse out, I do believe there is some genuinely messed up stuff happening in North Korea. Even the end of the 3rd season of the podcast Blowback, which is amazing by the way, you should all go watch it, which very much leans towards taking North Korea's side in the conflict, ends with a discussion of multi-generational prisons being a thing in North Korea, where people can be jailed for the crime of a family member. While America has the biggest prison system of any country in the history of the world, and there is a great deal of hypocrisy between America getting to call its system prisons and North Korea's system camps, it doesn't inherently justify what North Korea is doing. Now, I'll be the first to admit that many of the problems in North Korea are the result of American imperialism, or at least exacerbated by it. My previous video was literally all about how many of the problems in socialist countries is caused by external pressure. But that doesn't necessarily justify every crime. The Kims having a political dynasty, even if defenders of the DPRK want to claim that it's just for show, is still pretty much unconscionable to me as a leftist. I also really don't think that American leftists should go out of their way to tell people how much they like North Korea, both because of the legitimate problems with the country, and also because most Americans view it as a basket case, and going out of your way to associate with the country is probably not for the best. I made this video to help people respond to anti-North Korean arguments, not necessarily convince them that it's a desirable outcome. But, in spite of all my misgivings, as I said earlier, I think it is important to correct the lies about the DPRK when they arise, and to fight back against these imperialist narratives, not so much for the sake of the Kim dynasty, but for the sake of millions of ordinary North Koreans. Thank you for watching.